The sun beat mercilessly upon the sandstone towers of Sunspear, bathing Dorne's capital in a blaze of shimmering gold. The air wavered with heat, rising in mirages off the wide courtyards and rose-hued walls. Prince Doran Martell had presided over many councils in the Water Gardens, but never before had his composure teetered so finely between resolve and apprehension. He sat in a high-backed chair of carved cedar, older and more frail than many remembered, yet bearing an expression that conveyed acute alertness. Those who looked into his dark eyes might read the tension of long-held secrets in the subtle lines creasing his forehead. A hushed quiet settled over the enclosed courtyard. The only sounds came from a lone fountain, its waters trickling over mosaic tiles into a shallow pool where children sometimes played. But there were no children this night, no echoes of laughter to soften the gravity of the moment. The sun had yet to dip below the horizon, but the hour grew late for Doran's retinue, which had spent days in hushed conferences. Raven after raven had arrived in Sunspear, silent messengers bearing grave tidings and urgent requests. Now, with the climax of their conspiracy poised to unfold, the courtyard felt like the stillness of a bowstring at full draw. At the prince's right side stood his daughter, Arianne Martell, resplendent in a flowing gown the color of the desert sands and wearing an air of sharpened determination. Her dark hair tumbled in loose waves around her shoulders, framing a face animated by a sense of thirst for justice. She had lost none of her fiery nature, though lessons hard learned had taught her to conceal her passion behind poised silence when necessary. Doran had entrusted her with a share of his secrets, and over these last months, she had proven adept at weaving them into actions. At the prince's left, Ilaria Sand watched the proceedings with heavy-lidded eyes that belied a restless spirit. Grief for Oberyn still clung to her as an open wound, yet it had transformed into a clarion call. The unbowed, unbent, unbroken motto of House Martell had burned itself deeper into her heart with each passing year, but especially since the Lannisters had taken Oberyn from her. The thirst for vengeance had not waned, though she had learned the subtle arts of timing and cooperation. The bitter events that had stolen the Red Viper from Dorne were not forgotten. Doran's measured approach had often frustrated her, but she also recognized the need for a wise hand guiding the fate of their house. Around them, the highest lords of Dorne stood in an uneven circle. Lord Ironwood, tall and grim-faced, with arms folded over his chest. Lady Jordain of the Tor, wearing a perpetually thoughtful expression. Ser Ryan Illyrian, poised at a respectful distance, carefully attentive to every word. Each man and woman there carried a simmering hope and a guarded trepidation about this rebellion the prince had so carefully planned. Much had gone into forging alliances beyond their deserts. Whispers of ships along the far side of the Broken Arm, vessels never seen in any official ledger or naval report, had brought them to this pivotal instant. The secret fleet had grown in the hidden coves of the Stepstones, aided by coin from the Iron Bank of Bravos, smuggled to the shipbuilders of Lys, and crewed by sailors from the Summer Isles and Volantis whose loyalty had been purchased by the gold and unwavering will of the Martell family. It was a risk like no other, for if discovered before the proper hour, the Lannisters would crush Dorne with their superior forces from the Red Keep's garrisons and the war-ready might of the Crownlands. But the time for hushed talk and concealed daggers had passed. Doran Martell had spent years preparing for a moment when Lannister power teetered on the brink of instability. He had not done it alone. Allies on the small council, now some in shadow, had supplied him with tidings of the Iron Throne's vulnerabilities. He had learned that the Lannister coffers, once flush with gold, had been quietly whittled away by the cost of the wars. Key shipments of new gold from the Westerland's mines had slowed. The Crown's debts to the Iron Bank had grown precipitously, threatening to topple their economy. Queen Cersei's hold on power had weakened, and her list of true allies had thinned since Tommen's death and the chaos that followed. The time to strike was at hand, or so Doran believed. He had spent nearly every waking moment piecing together the fractures in Lannister rule. He had studied the downfall of other houses who rose too soon or lacked the subtlety to see their rebellion through. But Doran was certain, if the fleet was discovered too soon, all would be lost. So, secrecy had guided every step, from hush-hush councils with the captain of Lyseni shipbuilders to discreet troop movements through the Prince's Pass. Those sworn to the cause had been trusted only with what they needed to know. And now, in the glimmering twilight, with an uneasy hush around him, Doran Martell found himself moments away from giving the command that would, if the gods were kind, spell the end of Lannister supremacy. He breathed in slowly, turning to face his daughter. Arianne inclined her head in a silent show of respect, yet her eyes spoke fiercely. Doran found no uncertainty in her gaze, only the reflection of the cause for which they both yearned. With a trembling hand, the prince pressed the arm of his chair and rose to his feet, ignoring the twinge in his joints. The hush in the courtyard deepened. Even the fountain's gentle splash seemed distant and inconsequential. "Send word to our captains," Doran said, addressing the assembled lords. "The fleet is to set sail at once for the mouth of the Blackwater. Soon, the Lannisters shall discover the price of all their treachery." No cheer erupted, no triumphant outcry. Everyone present understood the consequences of uttering such a plan out loud. Instead, there came only solemn nods. The rebellion was begun, not in fanfare but in stillness. In the days that followed, Dorne's usual routine seemed unchanged. Caravans continued to pass the Prince's Pass. Merchants peddled their wares in the markets. The princes of various Dornish houses continued feasting, hawking, and hunting. None wanted to give the slightest hint that a storm brewed beneath the surface. And so the secret orders traveled by swiftest riders at night, venturing over dusty roads to remote coves where ships lay hidden behind rocky outcrops. The men who manned those ships were a motley array of sailors, pirates turned privateers, and sellswords lured by the promise of handsome pay. They had been told they were sailing under House Martell's banner in a mission that promised both gold and glory. Beneath the bright sun, Doran remained in Sunspear with key conspirators, hashing the final details. When the first messages returned that the fleet had put to sea under cover of darkness, the prince's relief was tinged with dread. There was no going back. If Lannister spies uncovered the scope of Dorne's secret endeavor before they reached the Blackwater, no alliance or fancy wordplay would save them from the crown's retribution. For their part, the Lannisters continued to project a facade of strength from King's Landing. Queen Cersei sat the throne, supported by the flickering loyalty of the Crownland's lords who still believed in the Lannister name. Her watchers kept vigilant eyes on the Stormlands, the Riverlands, and the Vale, suspecting threats from those corners. Yet Dorne had always been too quiet for Cersei's liking. The queen believed she had outmaneuvered the Martells by decimating Oberyn and humiliating the family's ambitions. She had permitted a measure of self-rule to remain in the region, thinking the Martells too divided or too cowed to mount a threat. In her mind, the southern desert was either neutralized or easily crushed if they ever dared step out of line. If whispers of a Dornish fleet reached her ears, she might have dismissed them as rumor. After all, Dorne's known navy consisted of a modest number of ships, hardly enough to threaten the capital. The Lannisters' gaze had always been drawn north, not south. As the war-weary realm tried to mend itself, Cersei believed her main threats lay among the restless remains of the Stark loyalists or the Tyrell claimants still harboring resentment for her betrayals. But Dorne? They were sand and sun, sweltering behind their natural mountain passes, not a real danger at present. That was the story she told herself, and that, Doran knew, would be her undoing. Late in the second week of the fleet's journey, a battered fishing boat from the Stepstones arrived at Sunspear's docks. The fishermen claimed they had sighted multiple sails heading northeast, along with supply ships loaded with barrels of black powder, a contraband that had begun cropping up in the east. They insisted they had seen the golden spear of Dorne hoisted on some of the vessels, though half the ships flew no banners at all. The fishermen had only dared to approach for a brief moment before they retreated into rocky shallows, fearing the heavy-laden ships might mistake them for spies. The news reaffirmed Doran's confidence that all was proceeding as planned. Everything now hinged on timing. On the sea, Arianne's sworn envoys would coordinate with the captains to blockade the mouth of the Blackwater, capturing or routing any Lannister forces that might scramble to defend the capital's harbor. Then, a smaller land force of Dornish troops, marching secretly through the Boneway, would cross into the Stormlands. They had already secured discreet passage from Storm's End, whose new castellan had cause to resent the Lannisters after years of forced compliance. With the road open, they would be within striking distance of King's Landing, ready to pressure its gates. By the time the capital realized the scope of the attack, the ships would block off crucial supply lines, and the city would be caught between the jaws of a blockade and a well-coordinated land assault. Only the gods could say how many innocent lives might be lost. Dorne was not blind to the brutal cost of war. He had long avoided open conflict, hoping for a political resolution that could avenge Elia, Rhaenys, and Oberyn's grievances. But one heartbreak after another had proved that the Lannisters would never relinquish their stranglehold willingly. Vengeance was the only route left, vengeance, and a reordering of the realm that might bring about a more stable peace in time. Such was his deep hope, however naive it might seem on nights when the weight of his decisions pressed against his conscience. On the outskirts of King's Landing, in a small wine-soaked tavern built near the Rosby Road, a pair of travelers sporting weather-stained cloaks entered under cover of dusk. The place was small and largely empty except for a dozing innkeep and a bleary-eyed minstrel strumming a lyre from a corner table. The travelers settled at a secluded spot, sipped watered-down ale, and spoke in hushed voices. They were Prince Trystane Martell, unknown to most here, as he had not been in King's Landing in many a moon, and Ser Demon Sand, a trusted knight who had once served in Oberyn's retinue. The two had been sent ahead to sow confusion and misinformation in the capital, to gather final intelligence, and, if the situation allowed, to open the city's gates at the crucial moment. Trystane carried himself with a quiet dignity, no trace of the boyishness that once defined him. Losing his betrothed, Myrcella Baratheon, to a cunning Lannister scheme had hardened him beyond his years. He maintained a cold serenity, an echo of the love that had been ripped away from him. Demon Sand, for his part, wore a perpetual scowl. He had been the one to discover Myrcella's fate at Prince Doran's behest, and that memory haunted him still. As they drank the tavern's poor excuse for ale, a pair of Lannister guards stumbled in, each reeking of sweat and cheap wine. They were off-duty by their slurred speech, both leaning against the bar, demanding another round from the half-awake innkeep. Trystane and Demon kept their heads lowered, careful not to draw attention. The Lannister men bantered about the Queen's latest edict, complaining that she expected them to keep order in Flea Bottom with diminishing pay. One guard muttered about the cursed lion's arrogance, but an elbow in the ribs from the other shut him up before he revealed too much. The pair eventually returned to their drunken banter, providing Trystane and Demon with fresh insight. Morale among the guards seemed low. That was the best news they'd heard in days. Quietly, the Martell prince passed a few coppers to the minstrel, ensuring that the man would occupy the guards with song long enough for him and Ser Demon to slip out. Under the cover of night, they made their way through the winding back alleys of King's Landing, careful to avoid the main thoroughfares. They reached the dilapidated structure that had once been a minor storehouse for the city watch, but was now abandoned and rumored to be haunted. That made it the perfect hiding place for the small group of Dornish spies who had been embedded in the city for months. Trystane and Demon stepped through a hidden door. Two men wearing Dornish-style sandals rose from a corner, each quietly placing a hand on a hilt, until they recognized the new arrivals and nodded in greeting. There, with a single candle lighting their circle, Trystane laid out the plan. The fleet was on its way, and at the appointed hour, signals would be sent from the top of Visegnaz Hill, an orange lantern thrice, followed by a green one. The watchers in the city were to do everything possible to spark panic among the Lannister loyalists, set small fires in the western wards, spread rumors of a foreign invasion from the north, sabotage the city's stored grain. Anything to break the morale of the capital's defenders before the blockade became obvious. The watchers swore they were ready, though each man bore the tense look of one who understood that failure would mean the noose. Meanwhile, the secret fleet advanced like a phantom across the narrow sea lanes. They moved by night to avoid detection, staying well off the usual trade routes. The Lyseni captains were adept at navigating lesser-known channels, and though they did not love the hidden reefs or the risk of storms, the gold from House Martell eased all concerns. With them sailed dozens of smaller ships, built for speed and maneuverability, vessels that would run down any loyalist galleys attempting to flee the Blackwater. Among the fleet's ranks were the Lightfoots, a mercenary company known for their shortbows and their expertise in stealth operations. Their presence was essential to ensuring that once the blockade was established, no raven would be launched from the surrounding coastline to warn the Lannisters. Amidst this elaborate dance of subterfuge, Arianne Martell was not idle. She had taken command of a separate contingent of cavalry, which she led through hidden valleys and passes in the Dornish mountains. Alongside her rode her cousin, Elia Sand, and the famed captain Ario Hoda, whose long axe had long guarded Prince Doran's life. Arianne's face held a steely resolve that matched the stony ridges around them. Each day that brought them closer to the Stormlands filled her with a mixture of dread and exhilaration. She had lived under the careful watch of her father's caution for so many years. Now she was entrusted to lead a crucial wing of the rebellion. The weight of that responsibility pressed on her shoulders, but she wore it gracefully, spurred by the memory of Oberyn's passion and the knowledge that the time for retribution had finally come. To disguise their numbers, Arianne broke her riders into small groups, spacing them out over several leagues, so that any scouting party from the Lannisters might mistake them for merchants or travelers. They avoided major roads, crossing dusty ravines by day and resting in concealed hollows by night, always watchful for the telltale gleam of armor that might denote an enemy patrol. Though the weather was punishingly hot by day, the nights turned brisk in the higher elevations. Still, no one complained. The riders knew they bore the hopes of Dorne on their shoulders. Eventually, her force reached the outskirts of a modest castle belonging to a minor Stormlands house once sworn to House Baratheon. The occupant, Lord Rickerfell, had no love for the Lannisters but had little power to resist them openly, until now. Arianne sent her fastest courier ahead with a sealed letter from Prince Doran, promising the Stormlander autonomy and favorable trade rights once the Lannisters were dethroned. The next morning, at dawn, Lord Rickerfell's gates opened, and he greeted Arianne with cautious courtesy. Within the castle's modest great hall, a quick alliance was struck. Lord Rickerfell provided fresh horses and water supplies, as well as quarter for Arianne's men while they planned their next march. That evening, over a small feast of roasted game and boiled vegetables, Arianne probed the Stormlander Lord for news. He spoke of King's Landing's uncertain climate, rumors of increased taxes, heavy-handed policing by gold cloaks who feared the Queen's wrath, and a small but growing dissatisfaction among the common folk. It was exactly as Doran had hoped. If the seeds of discontent were well sown, the capital might be more easily taken. Yet Arianne knew full well that even the most furious populace often cowered behind walls when an invading army approached. Much would depend on timing, leadership, and the willingness of King's Landing's own defenders to turn on the Lannisters. While Arianne's cavalry resupplied, the secret fleet completed its final approach. They swept around the coastline at night, aided by new moon darkness. One by one, the ships dropped anchor near a secluded cove south of King's Landing, hidden by jagged cliffs. There, captains conferred in hushed voices. They would divide their forces. Half the ships would seal the bay, cutting off any attempt by the Lannisters to flee by sea or bring in fresh provisions, while the other half would sail up the Blackwater, aiming to seize control of the docks in a swift, brutal strike at dawn. Ballistae had been mounted on the decks of several larger galleys, ready to unleash destruction on the unsuspecting city. The very idea of turning the Blackwater into a blockade filled the sailors with grim excitement. It was a bold plan, and bold plans often decided the fate of entire kingdoms. Near the prow of the flagship, the captain stood with Ilaria Sand. She had ventured aboard the largest vessel, determined to be at the heart of the struggle, though her station was technically to wait for the sign of victory before stepping foot in King's Landing. She wore no crown, no jewels, only the simple vest of a traveling noblewoman and a silent, watchful expression that conveyed how personal this fight was for her. The men whispered about her presence, recalling the stories of Oberyn's wrath. They hoped that her anger might lend them luck in battle, though there was a hush around her, as if they feared speaking too loudly might awaken the ghost of the Red Viper. The night before the planned assault on the Blackwater, The sky was overcast, and the sea roiled with a light chop. Lanterns were kept dim. The captains worried that a single misstep, an accidental reflection off a polished blade, a drunken sailor shouting in the dark, could alert a Lannister patrol. Yet fortune remained with them. No watchers patrolled these waters, and the enemy's assumption of Dornish inactivity had lulled them into a false sense of security. Under that veil of darkness, a handful of small rowboats, each carrying a few stealthy fighters, drifted toward the breakwaters leading into the city's harbor. Their mission was to seize the watchtowers quietly, incapacitating any lookouts before they could raise an alarm. The lead rowboat was manned by the Lightfoot's best archer, a lean summer islander with skin the color of polished mahogany, named Jala. His eyes scanned the ramparts as they floated beneath the ancient stone walls. Just as the boat bumped the barnacle-crusted foundation, he sprang lightly onto a narrow ledge, rope in hand. In near silence, he secured the rope, allowing 2 more fighters to climb. Inside the watchtower's base, a pair of city watchmen sat around a small brazier, sharing a skin of wine. They never noticed the half-dozen stealthy figures slipping up the spiral staircase until the faint whistle of a dagger ended one guard's life. The other guard tried to cry out, but his voice was muffled by a swift hand clamped over his mouth, and he joined his companion in death. That quickly, the tower was in Dornish hands. Similar scenes played out in 2 more small watchtowers along the harbor approach. By the time the first thread of silver dawn touched the horizon, the Lannisters had lost their eyes on the bay. As day broke, the Dornish fleet advanced into the mouth of the Blackwater like a tide. One could imagine how the city, still groggy from the night, might have stirred to life at the sight of so many unfamiliar sails, but for the moment confusion reigned. A handful of merchants along the docks realized something was amiss. A startled fisherman rubbed his eyes, certain he was dreaming when he saw hundreds of sails with the golden spear of Dorne gliding past the mouth of the harbor. Within minutes, panic rippled up the city's wharves and into the winding streets of Flea Bottom. Then the alarms began to ring. The city watch mustered at the gates. Gold cloaks scrambled into formation, but with the watchtowers lost, commands came too late. Dromons and galleys of the royal fleet, anchored near the quay, were wholly unprepared. Some tried to hoist sails or ready oars, but were raked by volleys of flaming arrows from the Lightfoots. The sails of one Lannister war galley caught fire, quickly engulfing the deck in bright flames. Another was boarded by swift rowboats carrying fierce Dornish raiders who overwhelmed the startled crew in bloody hand-to-hand combat. The capital's harbor erupted into chaos. All across King's Landing, temple bells and horns blared, summoning armed men to the walls. People ran in every direction, some crying that the Targaryens had returned with dragons. Others shouted about an invasion from Essos. It was only when the first clear glimpses of Dornish sigils were seen that word spread. The Martells had come, and they were attacking with a fleet no one had believed they possessed. Queen Cersei, roused from her private chambers, rushed to the Red Keep's ramparts, demanding an explanation from her panicked advisors. Her eyes widened in disbelief as she looked out on the bay choked with hostile ships. She realized, with a flush of horror, that her earlier disregard for Dorne had been a catastrophic error. Yet the defenders of King's Landing would not yield so easily. The Crown had not entirely neglected the city's defenses. The scorpions and trebuchets along the walls were manned by men trained in siege warfare. Soon, massive stones were launched from the heights, crashing into the water among the Dornish ships. Some found their mark, smashing wooden hulls or dislodging the timbers of smaller vessels. Crossbow bolts large enough to skewer a horse whistled through the air, peppering the deck of the lead ship. Illyria Sand, on the flagship, felt the deck shudder under her feet as a scorpion bolt tore a chunk from the prow. She gripped the railing, calling for the men to keep firing. The captain bellowed orders to return fire with the ballista. Chains and grappling hooks shot forth, binding an anchored Lannister galley to their hull, and a boarding party surged across. A desperate, bloody skirmish raged upon the listing decks. At the same time, far from the coast, Aerion led her riders through the stormlands, accompanied by local allies emboldened by the surprise assault. Word of the fleet's arrival spread like wildfire. Reports reached her that panic had seized the roads into the capital, with refugees fleeing in droves. Some claimed that giant war machines belching fire had landed in the harbor, or that the city's great sept was ablaze. Exaggerations, perhaps, but they stoked the chaos that Dorne needed. As Aerian's cavalry drew closer to King's Landing, they captured minor Lannister outposts that dotted the region. The garrisons there, learning that an enormous fleet was pounding their capital, lost heart and surrendered, or were swiftly put to the sword if they resisted. The Martell banners swept across the countryside, forging a corridor of control. With the roads secured, Aerian's force quickened their march. Their aim was not to assault King's Landing's walls directly. That duty fell to the combination of the blockade and the infiltration within. Aerian's primary goal was to reach the roads leading into the city and cut off any attempt by the Lannisters to summon reinforcements from the Crownlands or beyond. Inside the city, Trystane Martell and Ser Demon Sand had already set their sabotage in motion. Small fires were lit in Flea Bottom, sending thick clouds of smoke drifting toward the Red Keep. Ragtag agitators, armed with knives and crude clubs, ambushed pockets of Lannister soldiers in alleyways, disappearing into the warrens as soon as the job was done. The gold cloaks were forced to disperse to quell riots, leaving the gates less guarded. More alarmingly for the Queen, several rumored supporters of House Martell within the City Watch began to mysteriously vanish from their posts, presumably to join the rebellion. Even the Red Keep itself felt the tremors of unrest, as Queen Cersei struggled to maintain discipline among her frightened courtiers. Cersei convened a war council, summoning her uncle Kevin Lannister, who tried to maintain a calm demeanor, and several senior knights. They debated how best to repel the Dornish incursion. Some urged a sally forth of all available knights to meet Aerian's cavalry on open ground, but Kevin argued they must first secure the harbor, lest the city be starved out by the blockade. Fervent arguments erupted about who had allowed Dorne to amass such a fleet in secret. Cersei snapped at her advisors, cursing their incompetence, cursing the Martells, cursing the very fact that Tywin Lannister's gold had been exhausted by prior wars. While the Queen seethed in her chambers, her men realized that the situation was quickly spinning out of control. The city was besieged both by sea and land, with only the northern roads offering a tenuous lifeline. That lifeline soon constricted as well, for word came from merchants that a portion of the Riverlands had also risen in quiet revolt, refusing to send grain or men to support the Lannisters. Spider's webs of alliances, carefully nurtured by Prince Doran's diplomacy, were now ensnaring the lion from every side. As the siege ground on, the inhabitants of King's Landing began to suffer. A blockade was not a swift affair, but its effects were immediate. Prices for basic goods skyrocketed. Bread and salt became scarce. The Queen ordered harsh rations. The gold cloaks clamped down on the streets, but each day brought fresh acts of sabotage from Martell agents, eroding the defenders' morale. Sporadic fighting broke out along the docks whenever the Lannisters tried to salvage a ship or launch a defensive sortie against the blockade. Amid the chaos, Aerian's cavalry encircled the land approaches to the city. She set up her command post in a commandeered manor house north of the Rosby Road, from which she directed scouting parties and negotiated with local lords who arrived, uncertain which way the tide was turning. One such negotiation ended dramatically when the lord demanded too high a price. Aerian's glare, combined with Aereo Hodora's looming presence and the knowledge that Dorne had unstoppable momentum, convinced him to lower his demands. Thus, more and more banners fell in line behind the Dornish cause. If not out of love, then out of fear. Weeks passed. The Red Keep, battered by conflicting rumors and diminishing resources, became a crucible of paranoia for Queen Cersei. She fretted over secret traitors in her midst, going so far as to banish certain advisors or have them arrested for the slightest show of disloyalty. The tension within the walls of the castle was palpable. Servants spoke in whispers of a queen teetering on madness, cursing her fate day and night, cursing Dorne, cursing the Tyrells for not coming to her aid. For it was true that the Tyrells, battered by their own internal politics and resentful of Cersei's past actions, had not marched to save the capital. Nor did any of the major lords from the Westerlands muster in significant strength. The realm, still nursing wounds from previous wars, hesitated to rush to the Queen's aid. Kevan Lannister attempted an organized defense. He fortified the gates, built barricades in the streets leading up to the Red Keep, and tried to inspire the troops by recalling the might of House Lannister. But a sense of doom hung in the air. One night, watchmen spotted a swarm of flickering lights out in Blackwater Bay. Suspecting a nighttime assault, the defenders readied themselves at the walls, but no assault came. The lights simply moved in slow arcs out on the water, the Dornish presumably repositioning or holding some nighttime exercise. No one slept in the Red Keep that night, expecting a storm of fire that never arrived. By morning, the defenders were more exhausted than ever, and the Dornish remained just as strong in their blockade. Finally, the day came when Arianne's outriders signaled that the city watch inside King's Landing was on the verge of collapse. Bread rations had run out. Disease threatened to break out in the more crowded districts. Riots flared up daily. The Queen could scarcely contain the fury of the mobs. Tristane's infiltrators had done their job well, helping to funnel the anger of the small folk toward the Lannisters. Many demanded surrender, though Cersei would hear none of it, threatening any messenger who dared speak the word in her presence. Sensing the final hour had arrived, Prince Doran Martell left Sunspear at long last, traveling in a well-guarded litter toward King's Landing. A small escort accompanied him, including Ilaria Sand, who had returned from the blockade to be at his side. They took a circuitous route, ensuring no Lannister outriders would intercept them, though at this stage, few Lannister patrols dared roam beyond the city's walls. After a tense journey, they arrived at Arianne's forward camp. Father and daughter reunited, exchanging a quiet embrace amid the swirling dust and frenetic bustle of the war camp. Doran looked more haggard than ever, but there was a gleam in his eyes, as though he had tapped into some long-dormant strength for this moment. He summoned the High Lords of Dorne and their new allies. Together, they drafted final terms of surrender they would present to the Lannisters, offering them the chance to relinquish the Iron Throne peacefully in exchange for certain guarantees. A slim hope, perhaps, but Doran wanted to give them one last chance to avoid a bloodbath. That evening, under a parley flag, a Dornish envoy approached the city gates with a trumpeter who blasted 3 calls, signaling the desire for negotiations. A harried commander of the Gold Cloaks peered down from the ramparts. After some delay, he allowed the envoy to enter the city. The streets were near empty, save for beggars and the starving who prowled for scraps. The envoy was escorted through the gate and up toward the Red Keep, under the watchful eyes of archers who lined the rooftops. In the throne room, Queen Cersei waited with a dour retinue that included Kevan Lannister and a handful of knights with battered armor. The envoy, draped in the colors of House Martell, bowed stiffly. He presented the Queen with the parchment bearing Prince Doran's terms. The Lannisters must renounce all claims to the Iron Throne and submit to a regent that Dorne would appoint until a new ruler could be chosen by a great council of lords. In exchange, the Martells would spare Cersei's life and allow her to keep a lesser title and lands in the Westerlands. The children and any potential heirs would be given safe passage to Casterly Rock. Those who had participated in the murder of Elia Martell and her children decades earlier would face trial, if any yet survived. All other Lannister loyalists would be offered full pardons if they surrendered peacefully. Cersei read the parchment with trembling hands. Rage boiled beneath her composure, but the reality of her position was painfully clear. Her eyes darted to Kevan, whose expression was grim. She spat curses at the envoy, calling Prince Doran a coward who hid behind navies and gold. The envoy stood stoic, repeating that the offer was final. If Cersei refused, the siege would end in blood, and House Lannister would likely be exterminated within the capital's walls. After an agonizing moment, Kevan gently placed a hand on her arm and murmured something. Cersei ripped away from him, her face contorting in fury, but her eyes glistened as she looked at the parchment again. Silence weighed heavily in the throne room. At last, she flung the document aside, glaring at the envoy. "Tell Prince Doran," she said, her voice hoarse, that I will see him burn before I kneel to him. Go. Give him my answer." With that, the envoy turned on his heel. Kevin's face fell. Some of the knights stepped back as if they feared the queen might turn her wrath on them. But Cersei, trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance, simply stared at the Iron Throne, as though she could will the situation to reverse itself. There was a hush, an understanding among the men that the queen had sealed the city's fate. When the envoy returned to the Dornish camp and repeated her words, Prince Doran closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. So it would come to this. Beside him, Ellaria Sand's knuckles tightened. Arianne looked at her father for guidance. The lords of Dorne stood at the ready, some muttering that they had expected no less from the lioness in the Red Keep. "Prepare the assault," Doran said quietly, with a heavy heart. "We have given them their chance." Thus dawned the final day of the siege. The Dornish moved methodically, bringing up siege engines from their hidden encampments, trebuchets that had been stored in collapsible parts and reassembled under the cover of night. The city walls stood tall, but the defenders upon them were weakened. Word of the queen's refusal to surrender had leaked among the small folk, who felt betrayed by her obstinacy. In many districts, open revolt against the Lannisters broke out. That morning, the city watch was forced to redirect manpower to quell a riot near Cobbler's Square, leaving the Gate of the Gods understaffed. Sensing an opening, Arianne led her cavalry in a thunderous charge, spurring her horse straight toward the gate. The Lannister soldiers atop the walls managed to loose a few arrows and rocks, but the wave of determined Dornish knights, combined with rebellious small folk inside the gate, was too much. In a stunning blow, a group of city residents battered the gate hinges from within. Arianne's force crashed through with terrifying momentum, scattering the poorly organized gold cloaks. At nearly the same time, the Dornish fleet directed a barrage of projectiles into the city's harbor defenses. Flaming pots of pitch and bundles of incendiary compounds rained upon the docks. With their war galleys decimated and no hope of escape, many Lannister soldiers abandoned the harbor, fleeing deeper into the city's labyrinth of streets. The blockade remained unbreakable. Ellaria Sand, though not a warrior by nature, stood at the prow of one of the galleys, her hair whipping in the wind, tears streaking her face. She could almost taste the ashes of the city that had killed her beloved Oberyn. She wondered if the Red Viper would be proud of this vengeance, or if he would caution mercy. She could not know. She only felt the weight of destiny as her fleet continued to pour fire upon the Lannister strongholds near the water. In King's Landing's winding streets, Trystane Martell and Ser Demon Sand led small squads of Dornish infiltrators to secure key intersections. They urged the small folk to stand down, promising them that House Martell sought not their destruction but an end to Lannister tyranny. Some believed them, others did not, but none had the will to resist in the face of a conquering army. Even a group of ragged orphans who had once thrown stones at Lannister soldiers found themselves assisting the Dornish by pointing out hidden caches of weapons the gold cloaks had stored. By midday, Arianne's cavalry reached the area beneath the Hill of Rhaenys, from where the Red Keep loomed. Skirmishes continued along the way, but they were quickly decided. Word reached Arianne that a second gate had been opened by rebels among the small folk, allowing more Dornish forces to pour in. One step at a time, King's Landing was falling. Queen Cersei, seeing the city lost, mustered what remained of her loyal men in a desperate final defense of the Red Keep. Kevan Lannister pleaded for her to surrender, to avoid the senseless slaughter of the city's last defenders, but she refused, declaring that a Lannister should die with a sword in hand rather than grovel before the Martells. Kevan, despairing, prepared the garrison for an assault. He ensured that archers were stationed on the battlements, that portcullises were locked, that the gatehouse was manned by men who would not flee. All the while, the dread in the pit of his stomach told him it was a futile gesture. Then, through the swirling smoke from the burning wharves, the Dornish army began its final advance on the Red Keep's walls. The siege engines that had hammered the outer gates were dragged into range. Stones crashed against the ancient fortifications, loosening masonry, sending rubble cascading into the dry moat below. Crossbowmen from Dorne exchanged volleys with the Red Keep's archers. Screams and the clash of steel filled the air. It was a scene reminiscent of every brutal war that had scorched Westeros in the last decades. Only now the roles were reversed, with Dorne as the attacker and the Lannisters on the desperate defensive. Amid the carnage, Arianne Martell rode beneath a banner of the sun and spear, her black hair stained with dust and sweat. She called for the defenders to lay down their arms. Some, hearing her cry, did so. Others fought on, loyal to the bitter end. Eventually, the portcullis was cracked open by a coordinated effort of sappers who had tunneled beneath the outer wall. Dornish troops poured into the Red Keep's courtyard. The last pockets of Lannister resistance were overwhelmed, though Kevin Lannister managed to keep a handful of men around him for a final stand near the throne room. He fought valiantly, but was soon overrun. Gravely wounded, he yielded, coughing blood, and was taken into custody, his eyes filled with sorrow and shame. Queen Cersei, hearing the screams and crashes grow nearer, retreated to the throne room itself. She sat rigidly on the Iron Throne, refusing to leave even when the possibility of flight still existed. Her lady-in-waiting had fled. She was alone but for 2 Kingsguard knights and a handful of gold cloaks. They held the doors in a fruitless last stand. As the bolts to the throne room doors were hammered down from the outside, Cersei drew herself up, wearing a fierce expression. If she was to die, she would die as queen, she told herself. At last, the doors burst open. A phalanx of Dornish spearmen poured in, quickly dispatching the gold cloaks. The Kingsguard knights fought with the valor expected of their station, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. One fell to a spear through the neck. The other was wounded, dropping to one knee, sword shaking in his grip. A half-dozen spears leveled at him, and he surrendered. Cersei remained seated on the throne, gripping its spiked arms with white-knuckled tension. Her eyes blazed with resentment, her lips curled in disdain. The Dornish parted, and Arianne Martell stepped forward into the echoing hall, flanked by a group of her most trusted retainers. She looked upon the queen who had brought so much misery to her family and home. A hush descended. The clangor of battle outside seemed distant in that moment. "So," Cersei spat, voice trembling, "Dorne has come for what?" "The Iron Throne." She gave a bitter laugh. "Take it, then. Carve it from my flesh, if you must." Arianne lifted her chin, her gaze unwavering. "We come for justice," she replied in a steady voice. "Justice for Elia Martell, for Oberyn, and for all who suffered under Lannister rule. This seat is no longer yours." With a slight nod from Arianne, 2 Dornish guards stepped forward. One carefully seized the queen by her arms, pulling her from the throne. She struggled, kicking at them, screaming curses, but her fight was futile. Her nails scraped against the iron blades of the seat as she was dragged down the steps. A rivulet of blood dripped from her palm, cut by a twisted blade on the throne's side. The Queen of the 7 Kingdoms no longer collapsed onto the marble floor, eyes wild and hair disheveled. She howled that the Lannisters would avenge her, that the city would burn, that Dorne would drown in blood. None heeded her words. Arianne made a small motion, and the guards restrained Cersei, binding her hands, silencing her shrill cries. At that moment, the doors parted again to admit Prince Doran Martell, leaning on his staff, accompanied by Ilaria Sand. The ruler of Dorne surveyed the scene. The battered throne room, the queen restrained at his feet, the battered knights and dead guards. He let out a heavy breath, a half lament, half relief. There was no triumph in his eyes, only resignation and a weary sense that the kingdom's troubles were far from over. "It is done," Doran murmured, stepping toward the Iron Throne. He raised his voice so that all in the room could hear. "The reign of the Lannisters has ended. From this day forth, let it be known that King's Landing belongs to the Dornish Alliance, and that justice for House Martell and the realm is finally at hand." Some Dornish spearmen let out a subdued cheer, but many were too exhausted to do more than bow their heads in relief. Ilaria Sand approached the throne, brushing her hand over its metal edges. She closed her eyes, as if communing with the ghosts of Oberyn and Elia, feeling that vengeance had, in some measure, been achieved. Tristain Martell, blood-stained but alive, entered with demons sans soon after, acknowledging the battered Kevan Lannister in chains. Kevan wore a haunted expression, speaking no words as he looked upon the broken figure of Cersei on the floor. Outside, the city roiled with the aftermath of the final assault. Fires burned in some districts. The Dornish hurried to extinguish them before the capital was reduced to cinders. Refugees scurried in the streets. The gold cloaks who surrendered were disarmed and taken into custody, while those who resisted were cut down. Gradually, a semblance of order emerged under Martell direction. Commanders placed guards at every major intersection, forbidding looting or wanton slaughter on pain of death. Arianne herself rode through the city, instructing her men to feed the poor if possible, to quell unrest, to treat the captured Lannister soldiers with dignity, unless they were proven traitors or murderers of Martell kin. She knew that forging a more stable realm would require winning hearts, or at least not alienating the populace through cruelty. Prince Doran, having seized the capital, set about the difficult business of governance. A new council was formed, with representatives from Dorne, the Stormlands, and even the Reach, whose envoys arrived belatedly to see if they could salvage relations with the new regime. Trials were planned for those who had participated in the atrocities against House Targaryen and House Martell decades prior. Grand Maester Pycelle was dead, having passed some time ago, so a new maester would be summoned to handle communications and treat the wounded. The bells of the Great September rang in a solemn tone, calling for peace and reflection. In the following days, Queen Cersei was placed under guard in the very dungeons that had held so many of her enemies in the past. Kevan Lannister, near death from his injuries, was given a bed in the maester's chambers. Some whispered that Kevan might be shown mercy due to his relative innocence, while Cersei's future seemed far darker. The Iron Throne stood unoccupied. Prince Doran had no desire to seat himself upon it, preferring that a great council decide the next monarch, in accordance with prior traditions. Yet for the moment, with the city in Dornish hands, many began to refer to him as protector of the realm. Whispers circulated that perhaps Arianne Martell would be crowned queen. Others speculated that a Targaryen claimant might yet emerge from across the sea. In any case, House Martell had toppled House Lannister's iron grip, and that alone felt like a turning of the great wheel in Westeros. In the blackened remains of the harbor, the Dornish fleet still bobbed, triumphant yet battered by the weeks of siege. Many ships had been lost to the Lannister trebuchets. The Lyseni captains, having upheld their contract, clamored for their promised gold. Prince Doran quietly ensured that the treasury, recently seized from the Red Keep, was employed to pay them. Word spread that the coffers were alarmingly low, but enough remained to fulfill the most urgent obligations. Outside the city walls, rows of fresh graves marked the cost of this rebellion. Dornish and Lannister soldiers alike had perished in droves. Common folk had been swept up in the calamity. War had come again to Westeros, ripping families apart. For all the Martell's cunning, for all Prince Doran's strategic brilliance, the victory came at a high price. But with the Lannister hold broken, perhaps the realm could finally begin a slow journey toward a more even-handed rule, if such a dream was possible. In the aftermath of this long struggle, Arianne Martell walked the ramparts of the Red Keep at sunset, gazing out over the city's skyline of mud-red roofs and winding streets. She wore simple travel clothes, a sword at her hip, her hair blowing in a faint breeze scented with ash. Below, the Blackwater shimmered, reflecting the oranges and pinks of the dying sun, filled with the silhouettes of Dornish warships at anchor. She wondered how her life would have turned out had Oberyn lived. Would this have been the path they chose? Would they have found a more peaceful way? Or was bloodshed inevitable? She could see faint torches in the courtyard as her father's men busied themselves with distributing supplies to the hungry. Beyond the walls, the fields were littered with debris and the battered remains of siege equipment. She let out a long breath, thinking of the weight of responsibility that would fall on her father, and one day on her. It was not enough to win. They would have to build something better than what had existed. It was a task far more complex than any siege. A hum of anxiety mingled with her sense of accomplishment. Stepping away from the edge, Arianne made her way down the winding steps into the keep's corridors. She passed a half-collapsed archway where a chunk of stone had fallen, revealing the underlying structure of the Red Keep. In that raw, unfinished wound of the castle, she saw a symbol of the entire realm, cracked, precarious, in need of rebuilding. For years, House Martell had simmered in quiet resentment, nursing old wounds, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Now that they had struck and succeeded, the question loomed. What would they do with this power? In the great hall below, Prince Doran was holding an audience. Representatives from across the realm queued for a chance to speak, to plead, or to negotiate. A scribe jotted down notes at a small wooden table, while guards stood with spears at the ready. Arianne quietly joined Ilaria Sand near the dais, exchanging a faint nod. Ilaria looked weary, but there was a trembling smile on her lips, as though she believed Oberyn's soul might finally rest easier. One by one, the petitioners approached Doran, who listened with patience despite the pain in his swollen joints. He assured them that the Martells would not plunder the city, that they wished to restore a semblance of order, that all who swore loyalty to this new regime would be treated fairly. Some reacted with relief, others with suspicion, but all recognized that the wind had shifted. The lion had been dethroned by the sun and spear. The entire realm would feel the ripples of this rebellion for years to come. As the last petitioner departed, Doran caught sight of Arianne and beckoned her forward. She stepped onto the dais, mindful of the hundreds of eyes upon them. The hush felt oppressive, as though every soul in the hall waited to see what House Martell's next move would be. Her father reached for her hand, and she gently took it, feeling the clamminess of his skin, the slight tremor in his grasp. "It is time for a new beginning," Doran said quietly, his voice carrying in the silent hall. "We have fought, we have bled. Let us now strive to heal. The Iron Throne remains unoccupied until we secure a lasting peace. We will call upon lords from every corner of Westeros to assemble and determine the path forward. Until such a time, I shall serve as regent, if the people will have me, and my daughter Arianne Martell shall be my voice." He paused, looking out over the gathered crowd. Nobles, soldiers, commoners. Some nodded, others bore uncertain expressions. The hush remained. Doran inclined his head, his dark eyes reflecting a quiet resolve. "May the gods grant us wisdom," he said, letting his gaze linger on Arianne, who nodded slightly in acknowledgement. "May Dorne's justice be tempered by mercy, and may we forge a realm no longer strangled by the memory of old wrongs." A murmur of acceptance rippled through the hall. That night, the city's bells rang out again, this time in a tentative celebration. Fires still smoldered in certain districts, but the looting had been contained by disciplined Martell officers. The fleets in the bay remained on guard, though many sailors joined in subdued revelry, sharing casks of wine looted from Lannister storehouses. High above, the Red Keep's towers gleamed in torchlight, overshadowed by the memory of dragons and kings of ages past, now overshadowed by the golden sun of Dorne. So ended the Great Dornish Rebellion, born of secret coves and a clandestine fleet, nurtured by cunning and alliances forged in dark corners of the realm. House Martell had risen from the desert to shatter the lion's claws, claiming kings landing through stratagem and a thirst for long-delayed vengeance. Yet in victory, they discovered the burden of rule to be heavier than any chain. For while they had broken Lannister power, the Seven Kingdoms still lay fractured, uncertain, forever marked by cycles of violence. Whether this new dawn would bring lasting peace or yet another storm of conflict was unwritten. In the hush of the Red Keep's corridor, Arianne Martell paused, listening to the distant echoes of the city. She thought of Oberyn's laughter echoing in her childhood memories, of his swift spear and the unquenchable flame that had once been his life. She thought of Elia, the sister she had never known, destroyed by the same cruelty that had marred so many. She wondered if today's victory truly avenged them, or if vengeance was ever truly complete. A tear rolled down her cheek, unnoticed by the guards who stood at attention. She pressed her hand to the cold stone wall, drawing a steadying breath. The realm was theirs to shape, if they had the will and the wisdom. Tomorrow, she would wake to a new dawn over King's Landing, the capital now resonating with the footfalls of Dornish guards, the banners of Sunspear fluttering from the highest ramparts. For the first time in living memory, the seat of power in Westeros was not held by the stag or the lion, but by the sun and spear. And so the story began anew, the next chapter in the Song of Ice and Fire, as the scalding sun of Dorne rose over the ashes of the Lannister age, promising hope and dread in equal measure for all who inhabited the Seven Kingdoms.